So, William, welcome, and thanks again for joining me today for a discussion on today's topic of the Smiley Face Killers.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. Before we get into the main topics of today's discussion, your Smiley Face Killer documentary and my theories on the alleged ritualistic murder of the SFK victims, I'd like to, kind of tee up a brief introduction for folks listening.
Okay.
And since your documentary title and your documentary and its title both offer a great introduction to the topic, I'll hand it back over to you for that discussion.
No problem. Well, I titled the film "The Smiley Face Killers" because that is the nomenclature, the title that people refer to this type of murder that goes back 20 years. It's always been referred to because of a smiley face that's associated with some of the crimes or some of the deaths. But Smiley Face Killers, and then I asked the question, who is abducting, torturing, and murdering young men in the U.S. and U.K.? When I started researching for the documentary probably 2 years ago, that was the totality of my understanding in the English-speaking world of where these cases were happening. And now I've actually grown in an understanding that there's more cases, Australia, these types of cases, Amsterdam,
Sure.
etc. So, but that was it. I mean, these cases go back. The original people, there was a journalist, her name was Christy Peel. She was on Coast to Coast a while back talking about this, and probably 20 years ago now. She's moved on. But the original writings about the Smiley Face Killers mainly were by two guys. One was a New York police detective. His name was James Gannon, and a professor in either Minnesota or Wisconsin. His name was Gilbertson, and they wrote a book called Case Studies in Drowning Forensics, and really did a very superb job in detailing these types of cases. And that's really what the baseline of all the information that I put in the documentary goes to, is their work.
Awesome. Yeah, and it's you put a lot of great information into your documentary. I can see where you had a great place to start. The professor you mentioned and the detective offer a great baseline understanding of this phenomenon that's occurring.
I agree, and I think that they really did the best job. There's been other commentators whose names I don't really feel like referencing, but they've talked about it,
Sure.
and they've kind of made a mistake. I think my documentary, as you know, is 3.5 hours. It's very long, probably overly long. However, I really went into detail and showed and analyzed a lot of the Gilbertson and Gannon cases, and also more recent cases that show that some of the misunderstandings or myths that are associated with the case are just that, misunderstandings, such as they are extremely drunk and wander into water, and
Sure,
I think
sure.
I showed through at least 5 or 10 cases where these guys, Kelleher, Dakota James, these are more recent cases, Lance James, these guys are clearly walking around, they're clearly
Absolutely. They seem to
ambulatory.
be. Some of them seem to be on their cell phones and talking maybe on their cell phones.
Dakota
Texting.
James, perfect example. You cannot be have a 0.20 alcohol content and be feverishly texting on your phone. So that's the more
I'll
recent.
attest to that.
Yeah, I mean, I've experienced that as well.
personal.
So yeah, well, I mean, that's just a perfect example. Is the Dakota James? That's a recent case. That was another case that, as I was making the documentary, that I've talked to other people where I'm like, if this guy shows up in water, I'm going to freak out. And that kept happening to me over and over again. Probably the first time was a case in Columbus, Ohio. A guy by the name of Joey LaBute was in downtown Columbus and just disappeared. And then 3 weeks later.
I'm very familiar with that case.
Yes.
Absolutely.
So that was a remarkable one. And these cases, all of these cases have not really been solved in a legal sense. They've just all been put in a terminology of an accidental drowning, and then the cops move on. And I take have a completely different conclusion, which is these are murders and body dumps.
Excellent. Well, I think that's a great description of your documentary, and I think you did nail it on a number of the misconceptions that are often had about this Smiley Face Killers phenomenon. I believe you highlighted a few there. I have a few more I think I highlighted as well from your documentary. But before we get into that, I'd like to ask you what caused you to get interested in researching the Smiley Face Killers?
It's a good question. So I think I didn't know much about the occult. I really didn't know about occultists or that part of history. And, I had gone and got your standard, degrees. And 9/11 happened. I studied 9/11. That led me to Aleister Crowley and this kind of cult this cult underground that exists. And so,
Interesting.
I was more so. My first book was Prophet of Evil, writing about Aleister. It's really about Aleister Crowley. My second book was about the satanic influences on the West Memphis Three cases. That's abomination, devil worship, and deception in the West Memphis Three murders. And then I wrote another one, which was Crowley's influence on the 20th century. It's Children of the Beast. Crowley was known as the Beast. Crowley's shadow over humanity. So I was always kind of inclined to try to figure out what's going under the surface and the symbols. That Crowley used so many original types of symbols, and he had his own drawing of what was the beast, the mark of the beast, and the seal of Babylon, and all these very strange symbols that had numerical meanings. And what really piqued my interest into this, what was known as the Smiley Face Killings, was my research into the occult background of David Bowie. David Bowie was very sophisticated. He knew all kinds of, above the level historical references and literary references, but it's pretty clear to me that he knew some occult stuff as well,
Sure.
particularly about Aleister Crowley. But when he passed away, his last album was Black Star, but he did a very mysterious, occult-influenced video for Black Star, where the music starts just as it's focusing in on a man in a spacesuit, and that man in the spacesuit is wearing a smiley face lapel or lapel or like a symbol on his chest. And that was really it, because I was very familiar with Alan Moore because of my writing about him in Children of the Beast and his use of the smiley face. And then this pops up in that, and I was like, well, what's this mean? And so I devoted a significant amount of time in my documentary to show the usage of the smiley face in modern culture. A lot of it leads back to, we can get into that later, but that was really where it started. So then I knew the Smiley Face Killings, and then I really started just kind of casually following it and really realized that there was something here. I read like I did with Aleister Crowley, I read a lot of the biographies. A lot of the biographies left information out. Well, a lot of the information I thought in other writings about these cases were left out. I really think that Gannon and Gilbertson did a superb job, and it's really fantastic that you can reference their detailed, investigation into these cases. But there's other things that are left out that I think that I kind of, added upon and put that into my documentary. And that was really how it got started, was me really watching that David Bowie video and just going,
Sure.
aha, what's that?
Well, that's interesting, William. I think you definitely add some very interesting things to the conversation relative to Aleister Crowley. I'm not familiar with all of your work as far as your writings go on the subject. However, what I have read and heard on the subject of your research, it seems very spot on and very well researched.
Well, I appreciate that. I was very I took a lot of consideration into footnoting and referencing everything in all of my books. So, I take that kind of position that you really want to be rigorous, even though, it's a nonfiction book. You really have to. But I think it's important so people can see what you've been reading.
Sure. And I think Aleister Crowley's a very interesting character in American history that is largely unknown to most of the population, because I'm sure I'm not teaching you anything here, but for folks of the interwebs listening to this conversation, Aleister Crowley was at the kind of the nexus point between NASA and Scientology. I find that really interesting.
Yeah, it's true. Right there, JTO, all those in Pasadena was Jack Parsons, who Aleister Crowley actually said he was his most important member of the OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientis, was Jack Parsons, running the Agape Lodge that had Hubbard and all these other scientists and people in the movie industry involved. And here's Jack Parsons talking to Von Braun. He used to call Von Braun and ask him all these questions and stuff, this Satanist. Right. And every time they would do a rocket launch, Jack Parsons would recite Aleister Crowley's Hymn to Pan, this poem of Aleister Crowley's. So
that's so wild.
Yeah.
In comparison to like a standard conventional history of NASA or Scientology, I'm sure Aleister Crowley's name is not mentioned very often.
I would agree with that. I think that's probably one of the biggest things overlooked in Scientology as a whole, is that its basis is the occult. And Aleister Crowley, Hubbard's son, said that his dad was an aficionado of Crowley, collected his writings, and he used to go over Crowley's books before he would do his early at the very beginning of Dianetics and Scientology in the late 40s and 50s, he would reference Crowley stuff, and there's actually a recording of Hubbard talking about Crowley, talking about the great magician Aleister Crowley. You should read him. Called himself the Beast, so he's familiar with a lot of Crowley stuff. And
that's fascinating.
Yeah, his son said that Scientology was black magic drawn out over a longer period of time, which I found pretty fascinating.
This would have been L. Ron Hubbard Jr.?
Correct. So, yeah,
okay.
He had a name. He was his first son and was there at the very beginning. Hubbard had the Dianetics for 2 years, and then there was bankruptcy and problems, and then he started Scientology, and his son was with him for about 8 years, and then they had a falling out, and he did a famous article for back in the day there wasn't the internet, so they didn't have information, but he did a famous interview for Penthouse in like 87 or something like that, where he talked about everything about his dad and black magic and drugs and all the stuff that Hubbard was really into that was really kept from the public.
Yeah, I really do think you're correct in your assessment that that's absent from Scientology's teachings, modern day teachings.
Well, if you start reading through all the promises and all these things, and you see where Hubbard got his ideas, where I even put it in my book where Crowley, his receipt of his most important book was the Book of the Law, and he called it, it came to me as a bolt out of the blue in 1904. And then Hubbard uses the same term about his book Scientology. It came to me as a bolt out of the blue. It's incredible. There's really,
that is incredible.
So the Book of the Law has all kinds of mumbo jumbo in there and terms and very rich jargon of occult and historical nature. But they talk about the one who came after. There would be one who would come after and interpret the book. And Hubbard thought of himself as and this is not uncommon in the occultists tradition, is that Hubbard himself thought he was the one who came after to interpret Crowley's work. And he was anti-Christian. There's a very strong anti-Christian. I mean, it's an incredibly strong anti-Christian position from Crowley and in Scientology. There's all this derogatory terms against Christ by Hubbard, which is pretty shocking, and a lot of people don't talk about that.
Yeah, and I totally see what you're saying. Yeah, and I think part of that suppression of that sort of information is very relevant to this Smiley Face Killers discussion as well, because, for example, until I watched your documentary, I had no idea that the smiley face symbol was rooted in not only the occult, but also had connections to Aleister Crowley.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. I mean, those guys, like I talk about Peter Christopherson, and these. I mean, I wrote about, the interesting thing is, before I even wrote about or made this documentary about the Smiley Face Killers, I had written about Genesis P. Orridge. His real name, I think, is Paul Hewson. But I wrote about him in Children of the Beast, and his name is, he basically ingests his own semen, and that's why he called himself Genesis P. Orridge, Genesis Porridge, and that's what he was into, because supposedly it gives him energy, right? Because these guys are into consuming bodily fluids, and if you remember in the part of the documentary, he's wearing a smiley face right at the end. So he actually, and Hewson / P. Orridge has a weird history that ties into Timothy Leary and all kinds of weird snuff films back in England, and Peter Christopherson.
Rock stars, right?
Rock stars, all these guys in was it Joy Division, and all these people just kind of filtering through the Acid House Underground, all that stuff. So, I didn't know about that either, but I just kind of traced this kind of phenomenon through people, and I took it different. A lot of these people who research these cases, they literally believe there's wormholes, that there's something paranormal, that Bigfoot's popping out from behind a tree, and I think that paranormal position is untenable when you look at the facts, and also does a disservice to the victims and the public. They're actually in a form of deception or creating this misunderstanding that I think is absurd. And
totally.
Those people will never be called on it too, which is a shame. But yeah,
I think that and I think I can see where folks try to fill in the blanks in some of these cases. I don't know if I would ever go to a paranormal solution to solve a murder. However, I can see where the need to insert information and where a lot of information is missing in these cases.
It actually is interesting because the more modern we are, there actually is still ties to the old legends of werewolves and vampires, where people had to justify how people disappeared.
Exactly.
And there were probably serial killers and abductors and stuff like that all throughout history that never got caught, but people came up with this fantastical thing,
Yeah, that's
that
exactly
they
what I was
explain
just
it.
trying to say.
So it's the past is present, these kind of things.
Sure.
And I don't believe there clearly are like death cults. There were death cults in India. That's where the word thug comes from. Is the thugim literally would allay travelers and abduct them and take their money and kill them in front of their god, And
Wow.
yeah, the English had to really try to wipe them out, wipe that tradition
So this
out.
was up till 100 years ago then still.
Yeah, so that was
Roughly.
actually, that's the people who record it were the English invaders, the people who took over India. But yeah, so
Sure.
I don't think that there might be something. And if you look through all these cases, it seems like there's some of these people like Chris Jenkins out of Minnesota where there's groups, there's somebody deceiving
absolutely.
or somebody drugging her, And the
Absolutely.
other more recent case was Zach Marr out of Boston, where there's differing opinions about whether he got back in and I tend to believe his family more than the bar, but his family said he was, they texted and said they won't let me back in. And then and this is like, the police should be all over this. This is ridiculous because these differing statements show that there's something amiss, which is the bar says, oh no, we let other people in. I can show you the CCTV. But Zach Marr's outside, and all of a sudden he disappears and ends up in the water, ends up in the St. Charles River. That's fairly recent, yeah.
Yeah, if I remember correctly from your documentary, Zach Marr was the case of the individual who the Boston PD later claimed to have on a separate CCTV camera.
Yes, that's
entering
right.
the water.
That's correct. And then they showed it to the mom, and she's like, I don't see it. I don't see where he is. Yeah. So,
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Yeah, so some of these, there's really, the police on a lot of these cases, I think they have more information than anything I could ever see, but some of these cases, it's like they're not following through. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you actually did make a solid argument in your documentary highlighting the kind of the suppression of some of the information or evidence in some of these cases, at least.
Yeah.
One that comes to mind is Patrick McNeil's case, which possibly one of the earliest cases, if not the earliest case.
Right. Like I think I called him, and some other people called him Victim Zero. So the foundation, Patrick McNeil out of New York, college student. I think he went to Fordham. Walks out of a bar, probably drugged, acting strange. I think somebody saw him throw up, turned a corner, disappeared, and then ends up in like a waterworks downstream from Manhattan, where another body is found almost a year later, Larry Andrews. And, right. So, and then the family doesn't know, and then they do an autopsy, and the guy's been like blowtorched, his teeth are missing. I can't remember all the injuries that he endured, but it's pretty clear he was tortured. And
I believe the autopsy in that case was actually suppressed from the family for a great amount of time, was it not?
Yes, that's right. I think they didn't find it for 10 years or like 8 years after, which is critical because they didn't even know what their child endured. And that something like that happened in the Chris Jenkins case, where Jenkins was holding some hair in his hand. It's pretty clear that he was struggling. This is the guy out of Minnesota. And the family had to look at the case files and analyze the pictures themselves. It's a disgrace. So, yeah, it's a shame.
That is, that's really unfortunate that a family would have to go through that.
Yeah. So she's the mother of Chris Jenkins is Jan Jenkins, and she did an interview with Ed Opperman about her book, which was it Profiles in Courage. She wrote a book about her son and the loss and how the police actually, it's one of the few cases where they change it from an accidental drowning to a murder, to an unsolved murder. And there's actually a video of the chief of police, I think, in Minneapolis, apologizing with Jan Jenkins, saying, we made a mistake. So
sure. Yeah, I believe I've seen that clip.
Yeah, so that's another one. But yeah,
that was an interesting case with Chris Jenkins because, if I remember correctly, his uncle was a high up in the FBI.
Correct.
And it's somehow that didn't even impact his family's ability to kind of get the investigation jump started at all, it seemed.
And that's similar to Corey McKeague. Corey McKeague disappeared out of Bury St. Edmunds last year, or I can't remember, 2016 or 2017, and his uncle is also an intelligence officer, and they actually They had never found his body. They actually went through this huge trash heap, but never found him. And that was an interesting case, too, because similar to the Kelleher case out of Boston, where they traced the pinging of the phone north, and they traced Kelleher's pinging south of the Charles River, and then he ends up back in the Charles River. But they never could figure out what car he got into, Corey McKeague, and where he is. So it's a shame his mom is tortured and the family's destroyed. It's awful.
Oh, I bet. Absolutely. It's got to be just a complete nightmare for some of these families, given some of the accounts that I've read.
Corey McKeague's girlfriend was pregnant, so Corey McKeague's loved one now has a child who will never know her dad. It's crazy.
Yeah, that is crazy. I believe there was a lot of CCTV footage of Corey's disappearance in your documentary, correct?
Correct. So you have him walking around. He's wearing a pink shirt, white pants, and wandering around, post-drinking at, I think, a gay bar, if I remember. There's definitely this strain of gay bars in these cases. But these guys are all very similar to Corey McKeague, Dakota James, Joey LaBute, all on their phone. And all these people were actively involved in, like, either Grindr or these other kind of pickup sites, which is pretty remarkable. And then, if you look at my conclusion, I don't really want to go into the full summation of my documentary, but these guys are also, the killers are involved in it, and the cops don't seem to put it together. So I wouldn't be surprised in some of these cases if the phone holds the evidence of the murder. And actually,
I completely agree. Yes, absolutely.
There's never been murders in LA, but the gay community here in West Hollywood, they've had criminals operating on Grindr who like roll gay men, so they put up a fake thing, and then the guy shows up and they get beat up. Somebody takes all their money and walks out. So I think that some of these cases and some of these murders have something like that, where then they end up murdered instead of their money. There's by the way, just to let the audience know, there's really no financial involvement in any of these cases. Nobody's credit cards are used. Nobody's money is taken, and that's another factual indicator of what's going on with these cases.
No, absolutely. Yeah, and that's one of the strangest aspects of this phenomenon is if this was a robbery, the individuals would be missing cash, Rolex watches, cell phones, these kind of items that are found on bodies of these victims, and it just does not compute with the facts of the situation. That they just accidentally drowned.
Right, too. And why are their belongings found in piles where they were last seen? Some of the cases, I think it's in La Crosse, like they're found by this statue of the Indian chief, which I found out later was a gay pickup joint or gay pickup area. So,
interesting.
Yeah. So, just the whole financial aspect of it isn't viable. It's not a viable way, path to go down.
No, and I think you're spot on with that assessment there, William. And I think Joey LaBute is a prime example. That is a case that certainly attracted my attention while I'd been monitoring this phenomenon, and kind of like how some folks, watch a sports team and follow the season and stats. I kind of did the same thing with the Smiley Face Killers for about a decade now.
Wow, so you go with that. What piqued your interest, or how did you get involved in following the cases?
I'd say initially, back around 2008, I was a former Air Force military police member, and I was stationed at a headquarters unit in San Antonio, Texas at the time. But when this whole Smiley Face Killer kind of phenomenon, I feel like first hit my radar around that time. Mm-hmm. I saw it on some news programs, and my younger brother at the time was a professor at Iowa State, teaching there, and I felt like, he might fit the target victim profile and kind of right in that region. So I definitely recall having a conversation with him about it, circa 10 years ago.
Right, smart. I mean, I think everybody should have conversation with any younger men, college-age men. That's the group, 18 to 28. Sometimes a little older, but yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, in all honesty, I think that may be the only way to kind of stave off sheer disaster come in some of these situations is the education of, hey, you gotta be aware of this. This is something that occurs.
And I think that's why this phenomenon has continued, is because most of the victims don't see it coming. None of them,
I would agree with you on that.
So they're just a night, and most men, I think, generally feel comfortable walking home from a bar at night. They generally, and women are not comfortable at all. Like no woman ever leaves a bar at night and walks home alone. Very rarely. They'll get a cab or get a friend to pick them up. So, the victim group is very substantial if there's a predator out there, or serial killer.
No, and I think if men were more prepared in situations, more educated, like as you stated, women, often are when they're out and about late at night, going to different bars and whatnot. I think if men were more educated, there definitely would be less instances of this.
So you've read Drowning Forensics then, huh? You read that?
I have. I came across that book in some of my own studies, personal studies, when I was in grad school studying criminal justice. And
get it at the library?
Yes, actually.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, that's where I found mine.
You can find that. Actually, I found that you can find that book in a lot of university libraries.
I've actually found it's in quite a few. I found mine at UC Irvine, so you're out here in California.
And it really is a very, very excellent book in the field of, forensic studies.
I mean, the forensics are incredible. I've never really been into forensics, but I appreciated the details and all the analysis and all the references that are in that book. No doubt.
Sure. But back to Joey LaBute, when he's a Cincinnati native. He disappeared out of Columbus, Ohio. Cincinnati native, at least his family is, because it was all over the news here in Cincinnati.
Are you in Cincinnati right now?
I am, yes.
Okay, gotcha.
Yep. And so I really took notice of that. That kind of really struck home to me that there's, while I had been aware of this phenomenon and kind of following it over the years, no one had really, been a Cincinnati person, so it was never kind of right in my face or anything like that. So I really took notice of that following Joey LaBute.
Yeah, that was remarkable. That was one of the cases where I've noted his disappearance. Jim Smith has been a researcher kind of going down the same path as me. There's been a couple others, his names I don't want to divulge, but he's the one who informed me about his disappearance. And LaBute is remarkable in a lot of ways because in that weekend that he disappeared was the Arnold Schwarzenegger weightlifting or some kind of bodybuilding thing. So there was a large amount of people from the outside. And I've always traced some of these cases to people traveling, that the perps are not just in that location. They go, there's cases like there was a case of a guy who died who disappeared and died when Obama became president. There was a celebration in Chicago. That guy disappeared. So these big festivals or meetings, and that goes Jimmy Slack in Pittsburgh, if you remember that case. He was coming out of all these places. Actually, Kelleher, Hurley, these guys are all coming out of either sports arenas or concerts, right? So LaBute was like that. And the interesting thing about LaBute, which a lot of people missed, is he was at a bar, but and also gay. His family confirmed that. But across the bar was a gay bar that was owned by the same bar he was in. So he could have walked out and crossed the street into that bar, and that was the end.
Sure,
something like that.
I also felt that LaBute was a remarkable case because he was not the folks he was with, his cousin and friends, I believe, stated he was not drunk. He had 2 drinks or something to that effect.
Right.
He walked out of the bar on his own recognizance, without his coat, without his belongings, and didn't tell anybody.
Right. And
so it seems that he is getting maybe got attracted to go somewhere, maybe got invited to go somewhere.
Didn't his last text have like that weird JST, like he was trying to spell a word but he couldn't do it?
So, yes, it did. There was some
JSTonage or something. I can't remember.
Some jumbled message, something like that.
So, that's a remarkable case. And then you have these other instances where like the CCTV doesn't freaking work. So he's in this bar that's bustling and the managers don't have good CCTV of him leaving. It's incredible. It's almost like it's a cover-up. I'm not saying that his bar owners are in it, but like you couldn't have you're operating a venue where people come and go, and you need to have, especially if you have 200 people or 100 people in your bar, you got to have CCTV in a high-functioning bar because people slip and fall, make false claims, supposedly get
liability issues.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So it's a joke. It's a shame.
Now, I think you make a good point because if there were folks stalking young men, that the bar would be the perfect place to go do that from. So working in a bar, owning a bar. I know there's often attributed I think, misattributed statement to a famous bank robber, but it goes something to the effect of, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is.
Right.
Well, if you're looking to stalk young drunk men, where do you go?
Where do you go? Late at night. You try to drug them. I mean, what if you're like women, right? What if you go to where the women are, like dance bars or places like that, right? Pedophiles
Sure.
go to like Catholic church or something like that. I don't know. You know, people go to what they're looking for. So if you like,
Absolutely.
yeah. So, I mean, I think that one of the there's another case that came out of, I can't remember the guy's name, Truth or Consequences, but this guy he ended up dying before he got tried. But Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. But he had a group of 3 women, and he was drugging women and taking them into some torture room for years. And they couldn't find the bodies because they were taken out into the high desert. But
I believe I've studied that case. Is that the toy box killer?
yeah, toy box killer, yeah. So, I
Okay.
mean, this is an incredible thing. Now, the victims are females. However, where are they going to find victims? A bar. And
Yeah, I believe, all those victims came out the bar.
GHB, right? So they're being drugged, they're being taken out, and they have a woman who in a lot, it's like the Harvey Weinstein thing. The women put the other women at ease, right? Because this woman is, she doesn't have these other ulterior motives that men do. So
Sure, yeah. Psychologically speaking, that should definitely put folks at ease.
yeah.
Absolutely.
So that's just another example. That was something I came across, and this is just, in my opinion, these are victims that men stalking men.
Sure.
So the serial killers are still out there. There's probably a couple, 2, 3 serial killers wandering around, and people should know that. I mean, there's probably at any given time a lot of serial killers in anywhere, but I think that there are serial killers targeting men. I mean, what was Jeffrey Dahmer, right? He had a certain target group. He would go to bars, right? And didn't he drug his victims? Same kind of nightmare stuff.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of his activities, his mode of operations do sound and seem very similar to what could be occurring here.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I totally agree. Yeah.
Now, you bring up a good point, and you highlighted it very well in your documentary as well about the GHBing of victims. Mm-hmm. Now, relative to Joey LaBute, I think that's a good possibility because you mentioned the Arnold Classic. It was in Columbus, Ohio, the same weekend he disappeared.
Right.
Well, that's GHB is a huge product used amongst bodybuilders.
Right, they use it to bulk up or something like that. Yeah,
it helps the muscles rest at night. I spent too many misguided years inside a weight room, being a personal trainer and whatnot. So I'm vaguely familiar with that community, and GHB is very popular.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's scary too because in these cases, there's so many people getting drugged that a bodybuilder would know, or they're almost like bodybuilders are like almost pharmacists. They know all these different substances to work. So like they know all this crazy stuff. Yeah. So I mean that could be a perp, as a bodybuilder, somebody really obsessed with their body.
I think it's definitely worth further scrutiny on the subject.
Yeah. So. Yeah, it's interesting. The LaBute case, too, you wrote in this outline that at least the PD, that was the one that said they were not in the water the entire 3 weeks.
Yeah, that's what was perfect. That's what I was going to bring up. And I think that kind of speaks to a lot of the other cases, but that's a prime example of what could potentially be the first honest law enforcement, department to conduct an investigation on one of these victims.
Yeah, I mean, that's amazing. Yeah, so I remember because they have very good on the scene reporting of the Joey LaBute body find in the Scioto River.
Superb.
Yeah, and if you look at that river, it's basically a pond. He was actually in a kind of a tributary, a little roundabout pond area, which makes it even less likely that he drowned, So it's like a body dump, And,
I've been not specifically necessarily to his area, but I've been on the Scioto River there through Columbus before, and it's not like a rushing river by any stretch of the imagination.
Right. So that's one. I mean, the other thing is the Dakota James too. I mean, people are telling me that guy, he wasn't in the water more than 2 days. That means he's missing for 38 days. Where is he? Same with Vetter.
That's a good example too with Dakota James, because in your documentary you had a clip from the Pittsburgh Police Department stating they had just searched that location days earlier.
Yeah. I mean, the lady who's the spokeswoman turns from the mic. When did you last search? And the guy says, "Oh, we were there this weekend." So
And I think that's one of the key areas that you did a good job highlighting is the fact that the bodies were not in its final location, the victim's body, not in its final location during the entire duration that the individual was missing.
Right. I mean, it's the same thing. Look at what Shane Montgomery, another perfect example.
Oh, that's a great example.
Amazing case. That's the case outside of Philadelphia in Manayunk. And, I mean, the water is 3 feet deep. They're checking the water, and all of a sudden, bing, his body appears, you know. And the cop says, you know, he was in 3 feet of water, 4 feet of water. Like,
oh, yeah. And even before that, I believe that's the case where they found his car keys in the same river.
That's right. That's very true. So, and you can,
and then suddenly 2 weeks later, the body's in the same spot. Like that's pretty. I mean, there's
come on. So you can find the keys, but you can't find somebody who's 6 feet tall. Give me a break. And that guy fits the victim profile too, like the BMI, super skinny, you know, young. I mean, I've talked to people online, and the BMI theory. There's almost nobody that's overweight, even mildly overweight. The only one is probably that one guy out of New York. I can't remember his name. Strozak. He was like the only pudgy one, but everybody else is in good shape.
Sure. I believe you also brought up the case of Tommy Booth out of Pennsylvania in your documentary, correct?
Right. And that was one of the Gannon Gilbertson cases. And
which I like to point to because there's some, again, forensic science behind there to say, well, look, this guy, it's been, you know, fairly well established. He did not accidentally drown. This is in fact a murder.
Right. That's a good point. And this is an easily area place that people, another example, people search, and here he is. I mean, I don't think he was even deep in water. He was really on the shore when they found him, and face down, and that's another example of like
within eyesight of the bar that he disappeared from.
Right.
Correct?
I mean, it's not even that far, 50 feet, and that's another one where the smiley face is there. But that was even more interesting because Gannon and Gilbertson recorded that his family didn't like the people he was seeing there. There was like a hyper sigil of all these weird markings that included a smiley face on the back of the bar near where he was found. And they surmised that, they wrote that that he might have seen something or did something that freaked these people out and they killed him for it. But they also, there was the guitarist, there was a picture of a guy who was on the scene that night wearing a smiley face t-shirt. Like it's just,
I did not know that.
Yeah, it's super crazy. So
that is crazy.
Yeah, that's an important case. The Booth case is a very important case.
I think that detail, though, like you said, where there's a guy there with a smiley face on his T-shirt, and it doesn't sound like that was objectively investigated at any point in time after that.
Well, that goes back to the other thing about people traveling around. These bands are traveling around. The people for the Arnold Classic are traveling, go to another city, do their crime or whatever, and leave. But I think Booth also had injuries that were consistent with torture. He had markings where a cigarette was put out on the back of his hand. You know, and I have to go back and look at that autopsy, but I think that he had aspects of torture.
That sounds correct. Yeah. Absolutely, he did have some
like his
something.
face was beat. Like, yeah, I forgot.
Some sort of abuse.
Yeah, that was another, abduction, torture, murder. So,
and it's wild. So now we've discussed a number of these facts and the details, and how there's forensic science behind a number of these victims. What do you feel is suppressing? Like, what's the impetus or what's the purpose that's suppressing all of this? And
I think I think there's overt and covert means of they're suppressing it. One, overt is these cases are happening over time, so it's not like some of these other serial killers where they kill a bunch of people in 2 months. It's almost like there's a delay, there's movement. So, but I do think that in certain people in Boston know something's going on. I think because also La Crosse. But some of these other cities don't. But I also think the incentive of the cops is to take things off the book. So an accidental drowning is a much easier thing than trying to ascertain a complex MO and motive and try to find out what's going on. I mean, it would take I mean, that's probably why none of these people, well, some people have clearly been busted because I show it in my documentary, but they would have to do a lot of things to find possible victims. So
I completely agree. I think a lot of it is very politically motivated.
Yeah.
Whether it be they don't want a murder on their hands to scare the community, or I even leave open the possibility that there's, political players that are involved.
Right. Well, I've had that.
In the entire network.
I talked to an ex-FBI agent. What's his name? It'll come to me. It's, I can't remember his name, but he said that there's politics involved. There's politics, and the reason why. And another thing is
I think that's a solid assessment.
Yeah, a lot of these colleges, they always cover up murders and all kinds of stuff. They don't want to spook the parents and make
that's
them
billions
think
of
that
dollars. I can see that for sure. Yeah.
millions. Those are businesses, dude. Those are huge businesses. They don't want to say your son or daughter could get murdered or raped and freak people out. Well, I'm not sending them to the University of Minnesota. The University of Minnesota is an epicenter of murder, man. There are people getting murdered all the time there. And I mean, they would never want to, oh yeah, well, we've had 10 killings that, we've never accounted for. Your son could potentially end up in the river. They'd never say that. So, I think that there's a lot of financial incentives to keeping it quiet.
Absolutely. I think you're spot on there. I mean, if you start having, I think there was an issue a few years ago at the University of Ithaca, for example, and the University of Ithaca had a number of their students winding up dead in the ravine, the creek, the river that runs right along the university. And they were issuing out statements, these are not related. These are, no one's killing these kids. And I think that is just to protect their bottom line.
I agree. I think it's kind of like, what is it, the Jaws thing, where they're at the Amity Island or whatever, and you can't think the mayor's like, you can't tell people there's a shark out there. This is our biggest weekend,
Right.
And it's kind of like that. I kind of feel like it's the same thing in the movie. The guy who I talked to, ex-FBI agent John D'Souza, I talked to him. It's a good interview if any of you or your listeners. But I think he was right on point. I think he got it right. He understood that there was kind of an occult aspect to some of these, and also that the politics keeps people out of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of times, the politics and the occult aspects of our society go hand in hand.
Well, I agree. Well, I mean, how many of these cops are Masons? How many of these cops are into the occult? I mean, a lot of these people in the police departments are Masons, probably the chief. So if there's an occult
and it's not even just the Masons, though, that I think are into occult, very occult activities, in our current day and age. I think it's just a wider spectrum of secret societies.
Well, yeah, no doubt.
And that's kind of gonna segue into my theory of the occult ritualistic natures of some of these murders. And the theory I'm exploring is, are these Smiley Face Killer victims a modern day example of a human sacrifice?
Right. Yeah.
And
well, that's a good question.
That's deeply rooted in occult history.
Absolutely.
Ritual sacrifices.
No doubt. Well, I mean, there are witch sacrifices that involve water, and West Memphis 3, there's other people, Kenneth Anger, the king of witches, Alexander's, they've all totemically dropped people in water to disperse. It's something to do with the spirit disperses in the water. So these are all water deaths, and if you look at my documentary, I surmise that, a lot of these people are pre-drowned. They're not drowned in the water they're in, and that's how it's easy to get the bodies in the water, make it look like a drowning. So,
and I think that's a prime example. Back to Joey LaBute, when the Columbus PD said he's not been in the water for 3 weeks. He didn't die. He quote unquote most likely died before going into the water.
Right. That's right.
So
yeah, I mean, I think your idea of human sacrifice is not outside of the realm of possibility. I think, yeah.
Have you come across any occult societies that, in your research, your occult researches, that have been focused or interested in the mounds that exist in America?
Not in Denver. I've come across the people writing about the mound theory and the old Indian theory associated with the American crimes, and just because of, like, for example, a cross, I think, had the statue of the chiefs in Sinawa. There was writing. I think Gannon talked about it. People have talked about the Indian aspect to it. And, the problem with me with that is that it's specified just in the Midwest, because these crimes are happening in the UK, Thailand, all over Spain. There were cases. So for me, that would diminish the possibility or plausibility of somebody committing these crimes to have some kind of old, Aztec style, Indian style human sacrifice. That's my opinion. What's your thought on it?
I think we, as a society, as America in general, as a history goes, we've been this history of the mounds. America's history of the mounds has been hidden away. It's actually an occulted history of
Yeah,
sorts.
no doubt. Yeah, I mean, there's some cities by you called Moundsville. They took the
Oh,
mounds and they
absolutely.
scraped them off.
Well,
Destroyed them.
that's funny you mentioned that because so modern day Moundsville, West Virginia, you have a 65, 70-foot conical mound sitting there today.
Yeah.
Now, that mound specifically ties in directly into America's history because that was George Washington's favorite mound.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
So George Washington and all of the founding fathers were deeply interested in the mounds. Not just Washington and his secret society that he was the first that he started.
What secret society is that?
That's the Society of the Cincinnati.
Oh, Cincinnati. Yeah, right. I mean, that's actually a huge. Have you ever seen that building that's in D.C., Cincinnati Society?
Oh, absolutely. I lived
That's
in
beautiful.
D.C. for
Yeah.
about 4 years. Absolutely.
Yeah. What years were you there for?
Let's see here. Maybe 6 years. 2008 and 2009. It was 2008 to 2012. So 4 years.
Recently, yeah. Gotcha.
Yeah, I love that city.
Yeah,
Yep, absolutely. But I that's actually where I first discovered the Society of Cincinnati. I walked past their building.
Right. Wasn't Cincinnati like a Roman patriot? Isn't that where it comes from? Cincinnatus?
Cincinnatus, correct. Yeah, he allegedly took over the Roman Empire back in 500 BC, or I'm sorry, the Roman Republic in 500 BC, won some wars, and then gave the power back to the people.
Right. So
And that's kind of how Washington saw himself in the Revolution of 1776. He saw himself leaving his farm like Cincinnatus and, winning the war and giving the power back to the people.
That's
in fact,
fascinating.
he references Cincinnatus, I believe, in his last speech to Congress. I think it's the Christmas Eve speech, I believe.
Interesting. I didn't know that. I wasn't aware of that.
So the Society of the Cincinnati is all of the officers and I believe some of the enlisted folk from from Washington's army in the Revolution.
Interesting. Fascinating.
They formed in May of 1783 versus America was formed in September of 1783.
Wow. So before it even happened. Yeah, there's all kinds of strange things that happened right there at the founding of the country. There was all kinds of, there was the agreement of 1790, which was when Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton all decided to put the capital there at D.C. was done in a closed-door meeting in New York.
And all the men you just named there are all very interested in the mounds.
Well, that's fascinating. I mean, the mounds flow through American history. The whole basis of the Latter-day Saints was mound theory, right? I mean, all these plates are in mounds. So it was something that was in the original colonists. Clearly, they knew there were other civilizations here when they moved to the Midwest.
Absolutely. Yeah, I actually grew up Mormon. They're very interested in the mounds.
Yeah, I mean, all of it. That's Joseph Smith's big thing. He found his plate in a mound, and that was the history, was all these different civilizations, and they're fighting, and I mean...
Oh, absolutely.
The myths of the Mormons are pretty good, but yeah.
So back to kind of where my theory's heading with these mounds versus the Smiley Face Killer. I just want to build a quick picture of the mounds in America. Literally, America is built on the mounds.
Right.
The first free city in 1783, Washington, Pennsylvania, just south of Pittsburgh. That was built on what is known today as some of the oldest rock art and mounds in America.
Interesting.
Now, that same guy that founded that city, his son moved the capital of Ohio when he was the governor of Ohio, moved the capital to modern-day Columbus.
I didn't know that.
And when they moved that capital, they took the contents of a mound to make the cornerstone brick of the Ohio State Capitol.
Wow, that's amazing.
And that's about, if there weren't 2 blocks of buildings in between, that would be within eyesight of where Joey LaBute was found.
Right.
Just to kind of give you a reference point.
So then the other place is close to Pittsburgh or whatever, right? The
Washington,
Spring Hill.
PA?
Yeah, Spring Hill is close to outside of Pittsburgh by 10 miles or something.
Something like that.
Yeah.
So basically, all of these men of the society, these were the men that drew the maps of America.
Right.
They
George Washington started as a map maker.
Absolutely. And so the society began documenting all these mounds all the way across the U.S. I mean, even we'll take La Crosse, Wisconsin, for example. The first map that was drawn there was by Lieutenant Zebulon Pike, who is Pikes Peak, namesake for Pikes Peak, the mountain in Colorado.
Yep.
And, he was there documenting the mounds.
Fascinating. So you're saying
the Society of Cincinnati that was their first mission. So
Gotcha.
it appears that they started documenting these mounds immediately following the Revolutionary War, setting up cities around in and around the mounds. So I'm talking 1783 all the way to 1838 when Texas is being founded. That was founded in Nacogdoches, and that was on in and around mounds of Nacogdoches.
Fascinating. So you're saying that the Society of Cincinnatus created cities based upon mound structures.
Absolutely.
Gotcha.
And to speak to your worldwide phenomenon of these style of killings that occur in other countries. Now, there's a whole worldwide network of mounds. Now, granted, with a Christopher Columbus 1492 American history, it doesn't work that the mounds are connected. Mm-hmm. No one in modern day history or archaeology connects the mounds of America to the mounds of the UK, for example.
Gotcha. Mm-hmm.
However, I think they're incorrect. Okay. Much like Christopher Columbus didn't found America in 1492. Right. So George Washington obviously had an affinity for these mounds, built 2 replicas, 70-foot replicas of his favorite mound on Mount Vernon.
Okay.
His secret society set up cities all around America in and around these mounds for decades. I mean, long past Washington's life, they were still doing this for some reason. Okay. And Washington just happens to be the direct descendant of a Knights Templar who was a primary player in the Magna Carta. So
1100, is that right?
1215?
1215, gotcha, okay.
So Magna Carta is, by modern day historians, is recognized as the predecessor to the Constitution,
right.
the U.S. Constitution.
Individual liberty, ability to, talk to the king or whatever, entreat the
Absolutely.
king.
Freedoms, liberties.
Habeas corpus, right?
Absolutely. Okay. All most of our like I said, the U.S. like the items you just identified derived from the Magna Carta to the U.S. Constitution. So I find it odd that Washington is a direct descendant of the man who was responsible for the Magna Carta.
Okay. So
there's over a 500-year period between the two items, but yet it seems to be a lineage between the two.
Okay. Definitely an ideological lineage. Through the, Anglo-Saxon legal system, legal history?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. That's definitely the basis.
So what's the tie between, why is the mounds, why is somebody abducting young men, and what's the connection between that and the mounds?
So, real quick, just to connect the American and UK mounds real fast. Okay. The Knights Templar set up in and around the mounds of the UK when they took over that land. Okay. So to speak. So
that's what the Spanish did when they took over Mexico. Almost all those main cities are based upon a mound or some kind of temple or pyramid.
Right.
And you can even say that about modern day Israel. Even Tel Aviv, Tel is a mound, right? So modern day Israel is built on a freaking mound. There's tons of mounds in the Middle East. I mean, there's mounds all over the world, probably.
Absolutely. They're all over the world. And to speak to your Spanish settlement of Mexico, well, the Knights Templar weren't restricted to a nation. They were a worldwide organization and very, very focused and headquartered out of Spain, just the same they were Scotland.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
And the UK.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Basically tons of knights that invaded Mexico. I actually did if you want to go to my YouTube channel, I have a 6-part series where I talk about Bernal Diaz's history of the invasion of Mexico by Hernan Cortez. Really fascinating.
Interesting.
Yeah.
No, I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, I mean, it's an amazing conquest. I mean, the two civilizations, they just destroyed the Aztecs, and the Aztecs were, I mean, the interesting thing about the Aztecs is they were building a city next to another city that they didn't even know its provenance. They were in Tenochtitlan, and there was another one, Teotihuacan, which they just said was owned by the god people. It was the temple of the gods. They had no idea where it came from. It's another civilization. So these other civilizations clearly existed in the United States, UK, even before, modern history, probably before BC, some 1000 BC, 2000 BC, I don't know.
Sure. So that was I gave you a quick kind of just 101 on the American mound history and how they might actually connect to the UK mounds. Okay. So there might actually be and if that's true, then how much further do they connect is my next question. But back to the topic at hand, as far as the Smiley Face Killings go, and just I've honestly just started off with the cases outlined in drownings and forensics.
Gotcha.
because I can point to these are actual cases. Now
Right. What's that? 20 cases, maybe?
yeah, I think it's a dozen. Yeah, maybe 13.
2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. They did 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. They did 14 cases.
That sounds right. So I've kind of started there and starting to write this series of my thesis on the matter.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that thesis, my theory about the mounds being modern day sites of ritualistic sacrifices, many of these sites were the site of ancient, ritual sacrifices.
Right. Aztecs always dragged their victims up to the top of one of these temples and cut their heart out, right?
Oh yeah, I mean they seem to have some fairly bloody rituals.
Yeah. Really
now
bloody.
the ones in the mounds are less documented as far as the activities of the rituals go, but I think it's fairly well established from modern day anthropologists and archaeologists that the individuals that were sacrificed were of the same community. They weren't visitors to the area,
Interesting.
etc.
Okay.
Now, one of the ritualistic mounds that were used, one of the mounds used for ritualistic sacrifice at one of the larger mound cities that still exists today is in Cahokia, which is southern Illinois, just across the river from St. Louis.
Mm-hmm.
And that mound is known as the Rattlesnake Mound, or as you previously identified as one of the clues from the original detectives relative to some of their cases in their book. Sinsinawa was a road where one of the individuals disappeared from. It was also allegedly marked at one of the sites in Michigan for a victim. Well, Sinsinawa means rattlesnake mound.
Interesting, fascinating.
So there are some, very kind of rough connections, tenuous connections to mounds already based upon their research from the original detectives.
Right.
So I kind of took that a step further and I said, well, if this could be a thing, then where are there not mounds? So I identified an entire state that there are not mounds.
Which is?
New Mexico.
Okay.
And I compared that, their city of Albuquerque, to the city of La Crosse, as far as statistics go relative to these style drownings, these quote-unquote accidental drownings. So, given the details of what we've kind of already established as some of the key facts in these incidents,
mm-hmm.
Albuquerque registers 0 drowning incidents that would qualify under these kind of smiley face killing, characteristics.
Same MO, right? Yeah.
So, La Crosse, Wisconsin, for example, they have 8+ victims.
Right.
And roughly, I believe the last 20 years, maybe?
Sounds right. I mean, they've had quite a few.
So, La Crosse, Wisconsin has a high concentration of mounds. Quite possibly, Wisconsin seems to have the highest concentration of effigy mounds throughout the entire world.
Interesting. So, are you saying you think that this mound is associated with the secret society of the Cincinnatus?
Well, while they definitely had a great interest in the mounds, other secret societies since then have definitely showed interest as well, including the secret societies within the Catholic Church, the Vatican, mm-hmm. the Jesuits, to be more specific. Mm-hmm. If you want to call Walmart a modern-day secret society, I mean, what does the Walmart family own? About $150 billion?
At least, yeah.
And, no one knows what they discuss in their board meetings, but they have they show a great pattern of building Walmart stores on top of mounds.
Really interesting. I didn't know that.
And then they're not the only ones. I mean, government buildings, right. Catholic churches, Masonic lodges. I mean, there are a lot of secret societies that definitely enjoy these mounds or have an affinity for these mounds.
Right.
So what I'm saying is that I see it more as a modern day occult group, essentially following some practices they have throughout history. Maybe they're newer practices they're just applying to older occult sites.
Interesting.
So, and just in comparison, where La Crosse has 8+ victims, they have 52,000 residents, 11,000 students. Albuquerque, 0 victims, 0 mounds, 10 times the population as La Crosse, 3 times as many students as La Crosse, and the river goes right through town. So it seems odd that there wouldn't be at least some correlation, you know what I mean, between those two locations.
Yeah, it's odd. I mean, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what to think. I mean, I think that the mounds, there could be something there, but for me, I think the motivation is, there. I mean, there's always been my thought in the back of my mind that there's some kind of like human sacrifice aspect to this. Like if you look at, God, what was it? If you look at the old myth of Hadrian, right? He had his ideal gay lover was this guy by the name of Antinous, right? Antinous, who popped up in the whole Pizzagate investigation with
I'm familiar.
Right, and he supposedly drowned or was drowned or sacrificed in the Nile, right? So,
I did not know that.
Yeah, so that Antinous is like a gay ideal that has gone on for thousands of years within that community, right? Is this kind of like this young lover, and then he dies when he's young. So it might have something like that, So
yeah, it's very possible.
And there's your sacrifice, there's your kind of thing, But I have to look more into this mound stuff. But I think that the thing is that there's some out here in L.A. that you know of Van Zandt, but there was Roberson, a couple other guys. Roberson.
Yeah, I sent you Van Zandt. That's an interesting case. I actually served time with that man in the like I said, the Air Force military police on a deployment, and we have common people or had comming people, I presume.
Do you think that he was abducted, or do you think he disappeared or committed suicide?
I wouldn't have any personal, thing to weigh in on that. However, I do say his case seems very suspect to fall in this same line of smiley face victims.
Yep, same thing. Out at a bar, I live by there. I live by Hermosa, so I know exactly where that liquor store was that he was last seen. But they, the cops there did some more research, and they said that he was last seen with a group of people he didn't know going into a parking garage. Which I know exactly where that parking garage is. So.
Interesting.
Yeah, super sketchy. Yeah, that's a real odd one. He was.
I think a lot of times, just like that, there's an additional detail that could weigh in heavily on solving these cases.
I agree.
For example, two of the early cases, they wrestled together on the same varsity high school team.
That's right.
Varsity wrestling team in Wisconsin.
Well, there were two other cases where the parents worked together at the same high school. It was, which I didn't include. What was that guy's name? It was in Wisconsin. I think it was. It'll come to me.
Yeah, I mean, Wisconsin's a hotbed because I know 5 of the victims are from the same county, and one of the victims, his father was the sheriff in that county.
Wow, no, it was Nathan Edberg. No, what was it? It's Nick Rossini and Nathan. No, it was Nick Rossini and somebody out of Wisconsin, Minnesota. Rossini and somebody else, the mothers knew each other, and they both ended up.
I'm not familiar
and
with that.
Rossini was one in the documentary where, out jogging and then found in 3 feet of water. Super sketchy.
That sounds very sketchy. Whenever they go out jogging for something like that, and they expect to come back shortly, and poof, disappeared.
Yeah, it's crazy.
But relative to Van Zandt, I know that. There's not earthen mounds in California. However, there's a great record of seashell mounds.
Right,
That's Hermosa Beach.
Well, there was seashell mounds all over California that were they were this invaluable repository of thousands of years of history from people who had lived in California for millennia, and they just scraped them off. There were huge ones in Berkeley, and I'm from Northern California, and all around the Bay Area, they had these
Bay
mounds.
Area, absolutely.
So the local the local natives would go down to the same spots and fish for these clams or shells or oysters or whatever it was, and chuck the remnants in the same spot for millennia, and they were gone. And then some of those were supposedly 3 stories high. They were huge.
Sure.
So it's
oftentimes I think those are attributed to just kind of garbage. However, the ones that were actually excavated for archaeological surveys. In Oregon and in Washington and on the East Coast as well, in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, the seashell mounds, they had burials in there. There was stuff in there.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. Not surprised at all.
In fact, I can immediately think of a seashell mound that was used for ritual sacrifices on the Columbia River in I don't know if it was the Washington end of the Columbia or the Oregon end, but it's somewhere there.
Not surprised. Not surprised at all. Yeah,
So
I mean, it's a
I
lot of lost
wouldn't
history.
rule out Formosa Beach as being a site of a former seashell mound. I don't have that specific evidence like I do in Columbia, or the Columbia River site, but I think there's a lot of correlations that can be drawn there.
Yeah, I wouldn't know. LA was never heavily populated. It wasn't really a tenable place to live. It was just basically chaparral. So even before the Spanish, there were very small Indian communities, or
Sure.
native communities. So yeah, I don't know.
I'm just looking through my notes right here on what other mounds I had listed as far as their specific cases. So Dakota James, I don't know for a fact that there was a mound at that location. However, he was found on Neville Island,
Right.
and
That's right.
Neville Island is its namesake is for Colonel Neville.
Mm-hmm.
He was the aide de camp to General Washington.
Interesting. So there's something going on there. Yeah.
His son was the aide de camp to Lafayette, the French commander,
Right.
because the Society of Cincinnati is a French and American society. So it's on both sides.
Didn't know that.
Yeah, and Lafayette was the head of the French side. Now, Neville's son, Major Neville, was Lafayette's aide de camp. And Major Neville founded a town here in Claremont County, Ohio, just outside of Cincinnati, named Neville, Ohio. And you can go visit it today. There's a mound in the center of town still. So they built that town, Neville, Ohio, around a mound. I would not be surprised if Neville Island is named for the same reason.
Interesting. No idea. So Alexander Hamilton was a member of the Society of Cincinnati.
He was the second president. Yep. Yeah. So here's the other common
Paul
thing.
Jones.
You can see this in like Madison, Wisconsin, for example. So from Franklin, Massachusetts to Jefferson County, Washington, the state of Washington, these areas for some reason are named after these founding fathers, these Society of Cincinnati members as well, who had interests in these mounds. For example, Jefferson County in the state of Washington, large mound group. And it basically works like that all across the U.S. Madison, Wisconsin, Franklin, Ohio, Franklin County, Ohio, which is the city of Columbus. It's just a name game that I've kind of identified with looking at these mounds.
So the Cincinnati Society is fully it's a hereditary society.
It's a modern day knighthood.
Right, you have to bleed blood in.
Absolutely.
Interesting. Branches in the United States and France. 3rd century. Promotes the public interest in the Revolution through its library, museum collections, publications, other activities. Oldest hereditary society in the United States. Does not allow women to join her. There's a partnership called the Daughters of the Cincinnati.
And I don't know where they stand as an organization in interest to the mounds today, but for example, based upon my understanding of modern day masonry, there's a lot of their quote-unquote secrets that they've lost. I could very well see the modern-day Society of Cincinnati has no knowledge of these mounds. Or they could have a lot of knowledge. I don't know.
Interesting. So Washington was the head from 83 to 1799.
Yep, till he died. His last speech, he left Mount Vernon, traveled days in a wagon to get to Philadelphia to address the society before going back to Mount Vernon to pass away, basically, maybe 2 months later.
Do you think that he knew he was going to die?
It certainly kind of seems that way, given the circumstances.
Gotcha. Was it 1796? The farewell address? Is that what you're talking about?
The farewell address I believe that would have been his farewell address to Congress. Now, I believe he mentioned Cincinnatus referring to himself in that farewell address to Congress.
Cincinnatus. Yeah, I don't see it in here.
I can definitely send you a link.
I would love to read that. Yeah, that would be very interesting.
Now, back to La Crosse, you mentioned Riverside Park, the Hiawatha statue being tied to 5 of the victims.
Hiawatha, that's right. Yeah.
And now there's lots of I've mapped the mounds in that location. It's all in that little corner because that's a very important mound area because that's the convergence of 3 rivers. So
let me ask you this question: if something is associated with these deaths by the mounds, why haven't there been reports of young men being abducted and disappearing for hundreds of years?
I think that's a great question. I think much like the obfuscation of facts that we face today on this subject, be it the FBI's statement about there being no evidence of a smiley face killer, or being it the political statements from local governments or local authorities, I think it's the same thing. It's obfuscation of facts. It's suppression of,
Gotcha. So there
information.
may have been some group that is associated with the mounds that is interested in sacrificing young men to these kind of old primitive gods or something?
Sure. Absolutely. I leave open you nailed it, but I leave open two possibilities to achieve that. Either there's always been a group, since, it's a theology or a mindset or a philosophy that existed, back when folks were sacrificing on the mounds that we know they were sacrificing in America. The ones, in Cahokia, for example, we know folks got sacrificed from that community in that rattlesnake mound. So I'm saying either the theology continued in one lineage, or modern day occult groups are trying to replicate those same activities at those locations.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean,
here's another one
I
for
wouldn't
you,
be
Todd
surprised.
Guy.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, not in those groups, but they have some very strange ideas. The ones that I included in my movie are very strange.
Oh, absolutely. When I saw some of the your conclusions in your documentary, I was like, well, if there was a group that would be doing these type of activities, I think William Ramsey just nailed it.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy.
So, Todd Geib, here's one for you. Todd Geib, I think we can probably both agree that the forensics absolutely agree that he was murdered.
Right.
That was determined by numerous medical examiners and pathologists. The circumstances surrounding his disappearance are bizarre, to say the least.
Yes, very bizarre.
And he lived around and was found around the Half Moon Lake Mound Group.
Oh, so there's a mound group around there? Oh my God, that's crazy.
Right there.
And that's a hotbed.
He lived on Half Moon Lake. He lived there. I mean, that's where he was at.
Wow, that's amazing. Those, that whole west side of Michigan has tons of deaths. There was some I covered in there. There was a young kid whose name I can't remember right now. But there was another guy, a football player, who ended up dead, face down, up there. What was his name?
Colin Finnerty.
Colin Finnerty, yes. Good. Yeah, Finnerty was up there.
Yeah, I got a pretty good memory like that.
That's good. That's good for you, man. That's good. You're lucky. Who do I have up there? Travis Trowbridge.
Travis Trowbridge. Sorry. Go ahead. What was it?
Colin Finnerty. Travis Trowbridge was another one who died close to Geib.
Okay, I'm not familiar with Trowbridge. Yeah, was that a Lansing?
No, it was East Michigan, but he was. Covered him briefly in the documentary.
And I mean, back to your question, I just had this thought. Back to your question of, if this has been occurring for so long, why don't we have a great record of it? I mean, Michigan. When you just said that about Michigan, I don't think there's a city in Michigan that solves more than 30% of their homicides.
Right. No, I misspoke. It's Western Michigan.
Homicides.
I misspoke. It's Western Michigan, and even that forest there is Huron Manistee. It's an Indian name, right? The Huron.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, Michigan's filled with mounds.
Yeah, that's crazy.
And I think Detroit is probably the top end of thinking homicide rates, and probably Flint's the low end. But you're talking 10%, maybe 15% in Flint, and maybe 30% in Detroit. So even in modern day, we're not solving but a percentage of homicides in some states. Right. Small percentage.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And back to Todd Geib, the one thing I thought that Gilbertson and Gannon nailed in their book, Drowning in Forensic Science, there was the notion that there was a possible suspect in Todd's murder. There was a cocaine dealer, I believe, from Lansing, Michigan.
Yeah, that's right. Something like
that they highlighted. And Lansing's another town with numerous of these victims, these alleged victims, and numerous mounds.
Yep, there's a lot going on through that whole road. The 96 goes from Grand Rapids, Lansing, down to outside of Detroit. Where is Ann Arbor? Yeah, Ann Arbor. There's a bunch. Yeah, it's crazy.
And I tweeted back and forth with your researcher from your documentary, Jim Smith.
Yeah.
And I believe one of his favorite locations is a Lake Hartwell, I believe.
Is that Georgia?
Georgia, down there where he's located.
Yep.
And I mean, he and I were having a discussion the other day because Lake Hartwell and a number of the other areas around there are all sites of mounds.
That's amazing. Maybe there's some underground thing that does it. You know, like I surmise in my conclusion that there's groups talking to each other either through the dark web or through some kind of internet thing where they know this. That's how they learned this MO. You know, to abduct and do all that stuff. There's been I covered a couple deaths outside of Georgia, actually. Who was it? It was, what was it? Naz Mohammed died.
Oh, that was a strange one.
Yeah,
that was a strange one.
That is a very strange one. But that guy, there's a lot of fetish stuff involved with that dude. But yeah, it's crazy.
He was the Australian.
Yes, he's
residing
from Perth.
with some friends.
Yeah,
maybe?
he was with Perth. He was couch surfing. And,
okay.
Yeah, that one. I mean, I could talk to you.
I remember that case. That one stuck in my head. It was very strange.
I can tell you some stuff offline that just the police just dropped the ball on that one. Holy smokes! So
it seems to be the trend in a lot of these cases, don't you think, William?
Well, I mean, a little bit of groundwork would have helped a lot in that case. You know what he was told and what the police told and what the people who knew him told are all different stories. He just ran, you know, they said he did acid and ran off, and then they found his body and he was beaten up. Like, so how did he get beaten up? Did he just run off or did he get beaten up? Was his body dumped? There's another river dump. How do they know to dump in the river? How do people know to destroy the evidence, you know? So
yeah, I mean, it does seem like there must be some sort of network of communications out there, through some medium, through some facet.
Some way. Yeah, I mean, the rise of these cases conform to the rise of the internet. Going back to McNeil, 1996, 97. You know, why is that?
That's an excellent point.
How does that happen?
That's an excellent point.
I mean, you can trace those cases back. There's a bunch of deaths in Sydney, Australia, like 50 or 60 body dumps in just the Bay of Sydney itself, even before the internet. So how is this happening? Yeah. Oh, yeah, man. It's all over the place. It's happening all over the place.
What years did the Sydney, Australia deaths
I have
begin?
to send you the link. I have it. Let me see if I can find it.
Okay.
I'll give you the title of the article.
Well, William, I guess we should probably, you don't want to keep up too much of your time here. We should probably wrap these things up here. I do want to say thanks again here for this conversation. I do appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. It was great talking to you. Very interesting. The title of the article is Australia. This was in 2017, January 30th, when gangs killed gay men for sport. Australia reviews 88 deaths.
I just wrote that down. I'm definitely going to look that up as soon as we hang up.
That's amazing. So this is another thing. I mean, it's
that
crazy.
That sound, wow, 50, huh?
88.
88, wow.
Just there, yeah. So, I mean, I could do another 2 documentaries. It's hard to believe, but I did 3.5 hours. I could probably do another 3-hour documentary. It's just like, it just keeps going. So, anyway.
Hey, I'd watch it. I
appreciate that.
Absolutely. I can give you my highest recommendation as far as a quote-unquote fanboy. If you can call myself a fanboy of these Smiley Face Killings. You know, I've been tracking them for a good decade now.
Well, it's great to talk to you then, because, you know, we have a small group. There's a small group of us, not just me and Jim Smith. All have kind of developed an interest in these cases. Also, you know, it's very mysterious. Yeah.
Because I feel like this is an often under-discussed, mentioned topic of conversation, even amongst the circles of the interwebs that would discuss these things.
Right, I would agree with that too. Yeah, I
mean,
it seems like the conspiracy theory par excellence. I guess, you know, a lot going on.
But you figure as many folks that like, murder mysteries and watch all the murder porn on network television, be it your 48 Hours or your those kind of things. You'd figure there'd be more interest in these cases, in this topic.
I would agree. I totally agree with you. All right,
so that's
man.
kind of my goal is to kind of provide some more education in the matter. I feel like that seems to be what you're after as well.
I think so. I mean, I've done a lot of interviews, so the information's out there. And really, I just got it out there as a warning. You could end up as a victim. People could end up as victims of this whole horrible situation.
Absolutely.
So anyway, all right, JJ, I thank you very much for having me on your show. I appreciate it.
Hey, thank you, William.
All right, take care.
Out here.
Cheers.